Hello, and welcome to the Moss Adams presentation of SOC 2, a deeper dive into implementing the 2017 Trust Services criteria. Before we get started, we have a brief housekeeping video that will improve your participation in today's learning.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Today we're fortunate to have professionals Kim Cook and Maria Braun with us. Kim is a partner at Moss Adams and leads our IT auditing and consulting group. She's practiced public accounting since 2001 and has over 15 years experience conducting SOC examinations and providing performance audits, financial statement audits, attestation examinations, and internal control assessments. Kim's broad experience includes SOC examinations and IT compliance attestation services for technology and third-party administrators in the healthcare, transportation, and telecommunication industries. She also leads performance audits and provides internal audit services for government and not-for-profit entities. Kim is one of only 5 people at Moss Adams selected to perform the technical review process for our compliance audits, and she was recently named to Diversity Journal's 2018 Women Worth Watching. Joining Kim is Maria Braun. As a manager with Moss Adams IT Auditing and Consulting Group, Maria provides support for internal controls reviews, SOC audits, IT assessments, SOC 404 compliance programs, and SOC 2 readiness assessments, which is of real relevance to our topic today. She has extensive experience reviewing technology environments, providing social engineering services, and developing practices and protocols that help our clients clearly understand the information and the value of the information within their SOC reports. And for her work excellence, ongoing mentoring, and optimistic approach to parenting, Maria was named Working Mother Magazine's 2016 Working Mother of the Year. Maria and Kim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. Maria and I are really excited to share with you the changes to the SOC 2. So today's objectives are to start first with just understanding what's changed with the 2017 Trust Services criteria. I know several of you on the phone are actual service organizations that issue SOC 2 reports. So this will be important as you're looking to update your SOC 2 report for your next audit. And then I know some of you are more users of SOC 2 reports, and this will also be very useful as it'll help you know what to expect when you're evaluating SOC 2 reports and reading them in 2018. We're going to talk about the impact to the controls this new trust service criteria will have, what to expect with how to figure out what controls to add, where you should expect to have to expand controls, and really focusing on some areas there. Then with the new 2017 trust services criteria, there's more of a emphasis on evaluating services providers and vendors as well as risk assessment. So Maria and I will both spend some time diving into both of those areas so you can understand what kind of controls really should be in place to fully meet the SOC 2 criteria, but also just from an organizational standpoint, understanding that having good vendor management controls and good risk assessment controls are important for any organization, even if you aren't an organization that's issuing a SOC 2 report. And then lastly, we'll dive into some of the trust services criteria that have been a little bit more cumbersome in figuring out what kind of controls should be included for those criteria so that you really can report those controls correctly. And that'll be some good takeaway tips there. So the overall agenda is to first start with the trust services criteria, talking about then how to implement it, moving on to vendor management and then risk management, and then we'll close with some troubleshooting on the new trust services principles. So why the changes to the SOC 2? One of those things, it's always hard when we have to make changes to something that seems like we've kind of got it figured out and it's working well. But the SOC 2 has really seen increasing demands in the industry, and there's more and more users of these reports, as well as more companies that want to have SOC 2 compliance. And so the AICPA are the ones that issue the trust services criteria, and periodically they revisit these requirements to try to figure out, well, how can we make the SOC 2 better and more useful? And so that's really what's being done with the 2017 trust services criteria. Some of the things to focus on of why they're doing this is the SOC 2, when it used to be a lot of service organizations, now they're moving into different types of SOC 2, such as a cybersecurity SOC 2, or even just seeing companies wanting to have a SOC 2 audit done even if they're not a service organization. And this new framework really fits a broader audience. The criteria has also been streamlined to help reduce presentation redundancies, and it has a nice flow to it. So that's another benefit. Another thing that I think is really big is the integration with the 2013 Coso Framework. The Coso stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, and they have an internal control framework that's really used by public companies and private companies. It's really one of those frameworks that if you follow this framework for setting up your controls, that you have a very good set of entity-wide controls that are focused more just than just working on your typical control activities, but taking more of a global framework of your controls and really looking at 5 different components of the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. So this framework translates very well to going beyond just what people see in a SOC 2, and it's something that organizations are very familiar with. Lastly, it does have good coverage as to expand controls related to IT governance and cybersecurity. So those are some of the things that have been done with these changes that really make it, A, for understanding the changes, but also just for understanding why this is a better framework. So diving into some changes that are important to understand, just more in like the terminology and the details. The first is that in the past we've said the trust service principles, and that's been renamed to the trust services criteria. So throughout the presentation, you'll hear Marie and I reference the trust services criteria or the TSCs, and that's the new framework. Another thing is that as you dive into the specific criteria, you'll see that they specifically call out the Coso framework, which I mentioned on the previous slide, but they'll dive into the 17 principles of the Coso framework. So that's new. Something that's kind of stayed the same but just been renamed is that in the SOC 2, there's 5 options of what you can cover in your SOC 2. There's security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And these are all still the same, but they've now been called the trust service categories instead of principles. So you'll see in all SOC 2 reports that security is always covered, and then the other ones are covered as a service organization determines if those are a good fit, that they want to also include those other categories. One of the things that I like the best about the new trust services criteria is that when the AICPA issued these, they also issued points of focus. And so for every single criteria, they have several bullet points that are the points of focus to help you understand what kind of controls you need to have in place to meet each criteria. And these points of focus can be pretty extensive, and they also oftentimes give a little sentence after that, giving a little bit more detail to explain them. I think one of the things as you're implementing this, the points of focus can seem a bit overwhelming, and so it's important to understand that it doesn't mean that for every point of focus you need to have a control that exactly meets that point of focus. You could have you could have one control that meets several points of focus, or there could be some points of focus that aren't really applicable to your organization. But the idea of it is to make sure that you have good coverage to meet each criteria, and these points of focus will help do that. The points of focus isn't something that will be in your actual SOC 2 report, but this is definitely a good guide to use behind the scenes as you're updating your controls to meet the new trust service criteria. Another big change that we won't spend a lot of time on today, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned, is that when the new trust services criteria came out, the AICPA also introduced some updated criteria for the system description. So the system description is the narrative section of the SOC 2 report, and there's actually certain criteria that need to be in that system description. And these aren't major updates where you're going to feel like you need to rewrite your description, but there's a few things that you'll need to add, and in any case, it's still a good idea to read through these actual criteria and make sure that your system description aligns with this criteria. But a few highlights are, there'll now be a section to cover the principal service commitments and system requirements. So this might be something that was kind of embedded in your description in the past, or something that you didn't really draw specific attention to, but now there'll be a section where you'll need to include at least a few paragraphs talking about your system commitments and service commitments and system requirements. Another big change is that there's now a requirement to identify system incidences that occurred during the year if they were a result of controls not being suitably designed or operating effectively, or if a significant failure in the service commitments or system requirements occurred. So hopefully this isn't something that that occurs during the year, but if it is, now that needs to be disclosed, and you do need to explain the nature of that incident, the timing, and the effect. So that's something you'll probably get more questions from your service auditor, finding out if there were any incidences during the year that should be disclosed. Another very important fact, even though it's the last bullet point on this slide, is when do these new trust services criteria take place? And for any SOC 2 reports with periods ending after December 15th, 2018, the criteria needs to be implemented. So this is basically all December 31st, 2018 year ends, and any reports after that moving into 2019. Early implementation was a possibility. We've seen some clients who've implemented early, especially if it's the first time they're going through a SOC 2. It was easier just to start with the new criteria, but we haven't seen a lot of reports with the new criteria, so that's definitely something that if you're a person who's reading a lot of the SOC 2 reports as we move into Q1 of 2019, you'll start seeing these new reports with the new criteria. So I'm sure you're wondering, what's the impact to SOC 2 examination? So Maria's going to talk about how your scope of controls are going to change and how a lot of them are going to be the same, but we're going to have to find areas where new controls need to be implemented. And I talked about how the system description will need to be updated. And then one other small item is that you if you have it in the past, have to sign the management assertion letter, that'll now be required. The management assertion's always been part of the report, and management's always been responsible for asserting to this, but now signing that is required, and it's something that the signature doesn't go in the report, but it's more behind the scenes in the service auditor's file. The good news is a lot of your SOC 2 audit will remain the same. You're not going to notice any big differences in management of the engagement, the document request list, the process of doing the audit. It's more that there's good planning in advance of the examination to get your controls set up for the new trust services criteria. And then, of course, there'll be testing of any new controls that need to be added.
So let's have our first polling question as we're moving along this morning. So are you ready to implement the 2017 Trust Services criteria? Kim has given us a nice lead-in that gives the highlights for what's primarily been changed and the important pieces of this, and we'll take a deeper dive into that here in the coming slides. But where does your organization stand? And then as a reminder, we do offer CPE if you are attending this session live. You must answer 3 of the 4 presented polling questions and attend for a minimum of 50 minutes. So we'll take a look at our results here. And see how we did.
Great. So 26% of the people said they're ready to implement the new trust services criteria. So that's awesome. Maybe some of you have already been through it, or you have your upcoming audit and you're ready. 6% said no, but they need to, so it's great that you're listening today. 20% said no, and I'm not sure what I need to do. And that's great because this will help also. And then for about 50% of you, this is not applicable to your organization in that you're not issuing a SOC 2 report, but I think you'll still find this useful because hopefully you're asking your service providers for SOC 2 reports, and you'll have an idea of what will be in these reports when you read through them going forward. I'm now going to change over to Maria to talk about how to implement the new criteria.
Perfect, Kim. Thank you. With all of the SOC 2s to be issued under the 2018 Trust Services criteria after December 15th of 2018, a big question on everybody's mind is, what does the transition process look like? It can be very overwhelming when looking simply at the new criteria, since the wording of the new criteria is vastly different from the old one. How do we simplify the process? Well, we can break it down into 4 simple steps: mapping of the existing controls to the new trust service criteria, consolidation of the preliminary mapping, implementation of the rapid readiness assessment, and the gap remediation. When the criteria was first released by the AICPA, they have also released a rough mapping of the controls between the 2016 TSPs and the 2017 TSCs. Companies can perform the initial control mapping using the published documents to copy-paste the controls used to satisfy the 2016 TSPs into the appropriate 2017 Trust Services criteria to get a global population of the controls. As we were moving through the process, we have created a 2017 TSC Startup Control Toolkit that is used for our clients to help them transition to the new 2017 TSCs. After the initial mapping is completed using the AICPA guide, you can review and consolidate the controls. Removal of the duplicate controls will be necessary, since one unique control could have been used to satisfy multiple criteria in the 2016 TSPs. After the mapping is completed, review the controls for each criteria and remove repeated controls. As a second step of the review, consider any changes to the 2017 TSCs and identify any additional control areas. For example, for 2017 Trust Services criteria, Common Criteria 3.3, which aligned with the Coso Principle 8 to ensure consideration of the potential for fraud in assessing risks to the achievement of the objectives, it was aligned with 2 of the 2016 TSP criteria, one of which was CC 3.1 that talked about the identification of the potential threats, risk analysis, mitigation strategy determination, and assessment of changes. The biggest difference is that the 2017 TSC criteria looks at fraud consideration, where the 2016 TSC criteria was not specifically calling out a fraud evaluation, as such making it an additional control area for companies to cover. The last steps of the review is to determine whether the controls do not exist in the 2016 TSPs that would satisfy the new 2017 TSCs. There are a handful of the new criteria, such as Common Criteria 1.2, which aligned with the Coso Principle 2, and requests for the Board of Directors to demonstrate independence from management and to exercise oversight of the development and the performance of the internal controls, which have not been covered as the TSPs. So the companies undergoing the 2017 TSC SOC assessment will need to develop additional controls to provide coverage. The next step is to perform a rapid readiness assessment, which aligns pretty closely with the consolidation of the initial mapping that we just walked through. The consolidated set of controls should be reviewed against not just the specified criteria, but also the point of focus, and as Kim mentioned, is new for the 2017 Trust Services criteria. As a part of the review and remapping, the company will be able to identify any additional areas where the new controls are necessary and work to define controls that are required to meet the new Trust Services criteria. For example, the 2017 Common Criteria 3.3 that we discussed on the previous slide, which aligns with the Coso Principle 8 and requires the companies to consider the potential for fraud in assessing the risks to the achievement of the objectives, lists the following points of focus that are specified in Coso Framework: consideration of various types of fraud, assessment of incentives and pressures, assessment of the opportunities to conduct fraud, assessment of the attitudes and rationalizations from personnel, and consideration of the risk related to the use of the IT and access to the information. As Kim mentioned, you don't necessarily need an individual or unique control for each one of the points of focus that we've just discussed. However, your control or a set of controls that will be used to satisfy the 2017 TSC Common Criteria 3.3 will need to include the consideration of all of the above. Once the additional controls are specified, management should develop a remediation roadmap if these controls were not previously in place or operating, and schedule for the remediation. The most efficient way to manage the gap remediation is to identify a project leader to own this process and be responsible for the completion. The project leader should work with the individual control owners to identify the correct additional controls that will be implemented and work with the control owners to ensure that the controls are actually implemented. Once the additional controls are identified, it is important to work with your auditor and to share your mapping of the existing and additional controls to the 2017 TSC to ensure that the auditor is satisfied with the control set and to avoid any surprises when it comes to the actual audit time. The project leader should report progress and completion to company management and project stakeholders to stay on track. It is also important to consider the type of a SOC 2 audit that the company will undergo. As a reminder, Type 1 is a point-in-time examination which will only look at the design and the implementation of the control on a certain date. Type 2 is an examination for a specified period of time which will look back to the beginning of the audit period and not only review the design and the implementation of the control, but also assess the operating effectiveness. As part of the transition and the gap remediation process, the implications should also be considered, such as what could be the implications in the report if a company undergoes an annual Type 2 assessment and the additional controls that were developed were not in place for the entire audit period. We would encourage you to work with your auditors to make sure that you guys have a clear picture of what the process will be and any implications that may arise from that.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. So with our second polling question, how has your organization adopted the new Trust Services criteria? Did you do it yourself? Did you outsource it? You haven't done it yet, or you don't currently need a SOC 2 report? And while we're waiting, we've had a few questions come in that I'd like to, maybe one or two of them not leave for the end. So maybe, Kim, you can address this one. Edward asks, We communicate our SOC information to our CEO, who communicates it to our board. Is the evidence of the SOC team communication to the CEO enough as far as communication evidence to the board?
Great question. If I were you in this situation, since it's ultimately being communicated to the board, and I actually have a slide coming up that specifically talks about one of the new criteria calling out the board and independence, I would have documentation that the CEO took that report to the board, either as an agenda item or minutes, and I think that helps fully meet the criteria, showing that the report actually made it to the board. So that'd be the best practice.
And I can chime in here. I think the biggest thing to remember is that when it comes to a SOC 2 or any other type of audit, it is all about the evidence retention. So as long as you can document, and as Kim mentioned, retaining minute meetings would be one of those ways of documenting that this indeed was communicating up to the boards through the CEO, you should be good to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's take a look at our poll and see what our results are.
Great. Well, thank you for participating. It looks like about 17% of you are mentioning that you guys did it yourself, and that's great. So hopefully the presentation that Kim and I are doing right now is of help to you guys. About 5.5% have outsourced it. About 24% of you haven't done it yet, and hopefully that we're going to see that the slides that Kim and I put together will be of benefit to you. And about 55% does not currently need a SOC 2 report. And we will go on and move on to vendor management.
Great. Thanks, Maria. So for vendor management, in the new criteria, there's CC 9.2, and it says the entity assesses and manages risk associated with vendors and business partners. And what's different in this criteria than the previous trust service principles is that vendors and business partners weren't specifically called out before. Likely you had some controls around subservice organizations and probably reviewing their SOC reports or what you did for due diligence for subservice organizations. Common subservice organizations are data centers or co-location facilities, but I mean there's a long list of what a vendor or subservice organization could be. But there was never the requirement that you needed to assess and manage risk. So this is something new, but I also think it's just important to any organization to be thinking about this. Some of the points of focus here is establishing requirements, assessing risk, assigning responsibility, making sure there's someone at the organization that knows that they're responsible for the accountability of these vendors and business partners. And it could be more than one person depending on who these vendors and business partners are. Having a communication protocols, knowing what to do if there's issues. And then making sure that you just didn't assess them when you decided to use a new vendor or business partner, but that there's ongoing assessment of performance. And then if this vendor or business partner has access to confidential or personal information, making sure that there's commitments on keeping like non-disclosure commitments, and then also assessing periodically that they're complying with that. So those are the areas to be thinking about of where controls need to be added. I'm going to talk about how to do this and what are some good controls to have in place, as well as the artifacts to retain to document this has been done. So the first thing here is really identifying what's in scope from the perspective of your vendors and business partners. It doesn't mean that every vendor and business partner is in scope. You want to narrow that scope down to really understand, like, first, what is your SOC 2 covering? Is it the organization as a whole, or is it a specific system? If you have multiple products, is it just one product that's being covered, or is it all of your systems? So you have to look through it as the lens of what you're being covered by your SOC 2. That will help you identify that which services by vendors and business partners are being integrated with the system or product. Those would be key vendors and business partners for these controls. You also want to think through what vendors and business partners have access to confidential and private information. And the thing here is not to wait until the SOC 2 examination and field work of identifying these vendors and business partners. This is something that you want to be doing now, and you want to have a way of listing them out and periodically updating that. Because your service auditor wants to know that this listing is complete and that you understand what kind of vendors and business partners should be captured here. The next step is performing due diligence. If you're thinking about using a vendor or business partner, you want to make sure that you have documented procedures to show how you considered that they met the needs that for you, as well as that they had the controls in place that you expect. Examples would be like the correct security controls in place, or if they are accessing confidential or personal information, that they have controls around that. There's different ways you can do this. Sometimes having a nice checklist or written policy or procedure helps guide the process so that you're making sure you follow all of these steps each time. A key, too, is to make sure that you document what you did. You know, sometimes things are done in in-person meetings or through a phone call where you talk with the vendor and you have some questions for them. You want to find out how they handle different security scenarios, but it's all done verbally. So this is where it becomes important to document your results, who you talked to, what you asked them, and what you found out. Other things you could do is review their SOC report if they have one. That's a great thing to request because you know those controls are audited, and so you know that's really what they do. But if they don't have a SOC report, other things could be a security questionnaire or even reference checks. And some of you may be wondering, well, what do we do if we have some in-scope vendors and business partners, but we didn't know we had to have these controls in place, so we haven't done this in the past? If this is something that occurred out of the scope of your examination period, then I think the important part is that moving forward you have good due diligence controls, so that maybe you don't have how you onboarded them and what you went through the initial due diligence process, but you can still show that you're now assessing their performance regularly, because that would also catch any issues. The next step is once they've went through the vetting process and you've decided that they fit the criteria of what you need, is making sure you've really established the requirements with them through a contract or agreement. And making sure that contract and agreement really covers the roles and responsibility, compliance requirements, service levels, communication protocols, exception handling, and termination. Taking a close look there is important because that also helps with some of the SOC 2 controls, is that the contract or agreement covers these areas. And then once you've executed the agreement and the vendor and business partners started performing their services, you want to make sure that there's ongoing monitoring. And I usually like clients to set this up to be annual because that's easy to test to, and it's a frequency that makes sense. It's not so often that you feel like all you're doing is monitoring, even though I'm sure throughout the year there's always things that you're doing to monitor them, but to kind of formally provide monitoring annually makes sense. Also because a SOC 2 report usually covers an annual period, so the control will fall into occurring at least once during that examination period. For documenting monitoring, again, this is another area where it's nice to have some kind of policy, procedure, or checklist that's filled out for each of your vendor or business partners. And there's different types of monitoring that can occur. It really depends on what this vendor or business partner is doing for you. If there's a lot of data, doing some checks periodically that information is complete and accurate is important. Sometimes just having periodic discussions with the vendor or business partner works really well. If it's something like a data center where there's an actual facility that you can go and visit and walk through, that's a great control. Sometimes service organizations or vendors don't have very formalized controls, and maybe it's that you should actually be testing their controls to make sure they're doing what they should be doing. That usually needs to be something that's included in your contract with them, but that's a great way, especially if they really are have a lot of crossover in what you're doing related to the SOC 2, but they don't have their own SOC 2 report. Also, getting their annual SOC 2 report is a great way to perform monitoring. And the key here is to document what you did and make sure you're documenting that annually, that you're not just waiting until the SOC 2 occurs to get this done. I'm now going to hand it over to Maria to talk about how to improve your risk assessment controls.
Perfect. We will go ahead and start off with a polling question.
Great. So does your company have a risk assessment? It seems pretty simple, but this will be pretty important as we move forward. But I have a quick question that's from our queue. They're starting to back up a little bit, but one question was, would you say a telecom company has access to confidential information just by the fact it's going over their VPN, for example?
That's we'd have to dive into it more. I would say not necessarily. It depends on what they can really access related to that. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Maria.
No, it truly is a case-by-case basis. It's not a one-fit-for-all, and even though companies may be in the same industry, certain principles or the categories may be applicable to one versus the other. So it truly is needed to do a deeper dive, as Kim mentioned.
One that ties in with that then is, can you give an example of a vendor that has access to private information? Would this include all health benefit providers as one example?
Sure. We see this a lot in the healthcare industry, and same with third-party administrators, where they definitely are dealing with health information. We also have some clients more in the investment and wealth management, and we see personal information there because they'll have, social security numbers and things like that. So those are the most common. And we get lots of questions about personal information versus confidential information and whether you should have confidentiality in scope or privacy in scope or both. And there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts with that. The privacy category goes into a lot of detail of really dealing actually with the data subject. So on top of having the personal information, it's actually dealing directly with the data subjects. So that's one of the things that helps us figure out if a client should really have privacy in scope or if confidentiality could meet the needs of a service organization, even if they might still have access to some personal information.
And Kim, with your succinct answer, you covered one of the other questions that came in from Patricia, so hopefully that'll answer her question. Let's keep moving forward and take a look at our poll results.
Thank you. So it looks like about 82.5% do have a risk assessment currently for their company, and about 17.5% do not. I think risk assessment is such a global term and also a process that will not necessarily be only applicable for the companies that need to undergo a SOC 2 examination. It definitely is applicable across the board. So diving into the applicability of the risk management to the 2017 Trust Services criteria. As Kim mentioned, risk management is a pretty big theme throughout the new 2017 Trust Services criteria, mainly because of the alignment with the Coso. We have identified 10 criteria that will spill over to the next slide, where the risk assessment related controls are mapped to. I'm definitely not going to be discussing each one of the criteria in depth, but we wanted to give you guys a good reference that can be used after the presentation on where, in our opinion, the risk management controls can be mapped to. As you can see on the first slide, all of the criteria were Coso-related criteria. On the second slide, there is one Coso-related criteria and also two criteria that is just in place through the ACPA. Moving on to how to perform a risk assessment. As we mentioned, risk management and risk assessment are taking up about 10 different criteria in the new 2017 Trust Services criteria. And we wanted to walk through on how to perform a risk assessment. Risk assessments are typically performed to allow companies to take inventory of all data, systems, and vendors in place and enable for security, operations, and management personnel to come together and consider the organization from the attacker's perspective. The process allows companies to prioritize and allocate technology and staffing resources where they're needed the most. The first step of the risk assessment is to gather documentation internally that can assist in identifying potential risks to the company and the system. Several types of information that are typically collected can include the following: network diagrams, inventory of utilized hardware and software, security-related systems that are already in use, such as antivirus, network monitoring, intrusion detection and prevention, and others, vendor contracts, customer-related contracts, third-party assessments of your company, SOC reports for the third-party vendors utilized by the company, documented company policies and procedures, and guidelines. The list can definitely go on, and so the list will be very tailored to each one of the companies that actually go through the risk assessment. The list that we've provided is definitely not a comprehensive inventory of all information that can be gathered. We just wanted to give you guys an idea of what the typical documentation may include. As a part of the documentation gathering process, you will also need to identify the external regulatory requirements that are relevant for your organization. Example of these could include the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, HIPAA, U.S. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, FedRAMP, and the EU General Data Protection Regulation that just became in effect as of May 2018. The next step in the risk assessment process is to perform reviews to identify assets, which are typically the IT elements consisting of application and technology components, threats and vulnerabilities to the system using the internally gathered documentation and the understanding of the external requirements. These reviews can include management's review of the logical access and authentication requirements to the application database and the operating system layers, engaging a third party to perform a security awareness check for the company personnel using various social engineering techniques, IT personnel's review of the configurations for the firewalls, external network connections, and remote access systems, and the assessment of the physical protection mechanisms for the equipment hosted by the company. The key here is to review company as a whole, not just from the IT perspective, and identify company's key assets and potential threats and vulnerabilities to the company and the systems. For each one of the identified assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, management should host a working session to identify the impact and the likelihood. The impact will estimate the severity of the overall harm or loss that could occur if the vulnerability is exploited. Typically, the impact is measured as a low, medium, or high. The impact may have more than one risk factor that could be involved, such as financial risk, which is the risk to the organization associated with the impact the data could have on the organization's performance, operational risk, which relates to the impact the data could have on the effectiveness and the efficiency of the organization, strategic risk, or risk associated with the impact the data could have on the organization achieving its strategic goals, legal or compliance risk, which is the risk associated with the impact the data has on the organization meeting its regulatory requirements. Likelihood estimates the probability of the threat occurring and is also typically assessed as a low, medium, or high. After the assessment is completed, the management group should work to identify the remediation activities for each of the vulnerabilities prioritization program based on the criticality of the identified vulnerabilities and any business continuity plans necessary. It should be noted that even though the threats may be the same across different organizations, the assessment of the impact and the likelihood of the occurrence would definitely be unique to your company, since it is based not just on the threats, but also on the assets and the processes in place to detect and prevent the threat occurrence. One of the first questions that our clients ask us is about the presentation of the completed risk assessment. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. The appropriate output will depend on the company size and the resources. The final document could be in the form of a Word document, Excel spreadsheet, PowerPoint presentation, or SaaS platform output if a third-party tool is utilized. However, it's important to remember that all risk assessments must include the identified assets, vulnerabilities, and threats, impact and the likelihood analysis for each, and the identified remediation steps and procedures. And we will go ahead and move on to the poll.
Thank you, Maria. So our fourth and final polling question, what should a risk assessment include? And I'll give you a hint, Maria just covered this thoroughly. So should it include assets, vulnerabilities, and threats, impact and likelihood analysis, remediation steps and procedures, or perhaps it includes all of the above? As we're waiting for you to go ahead and get your answer submitted, I just want to take a moment and remind our audience that you do have to answer 3 of the presented polling questions to be eligible for CPE. That matters to us, and it matters to you. So what we want to encourage you to do is, once you've attended for 50 minutes, you can, at that point, download your certificate, but you might miss some of the great information coming up. Following our webcast, we will send you a link within 7 business days that will allow you to download that CPE certificate. Additionally, once you receive your on-demand recording, you'll be able to go back into it, download that certificate at that time. So your answer is important to us. We'll give this maybe another 10 seconds and take a look at those results. So maybe 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and let's take a look at our results.
All right, looking at the results, it looks like 1% of the attendees thinks that the risk assessment should include asset vulnerabilities and threats. About 4% of the attendees think that the risk assessment should include impact and likelihood analysis. Nobody has chosen the remediation steps and procedures, and almost 95% have selected all of the above. And now we will go ahead and move on to the next section.
Great. And just to clarify, all of the above was the correct answer. So the other ones are true because you need to include those, but you need to really include all of those different parts. Now we're going to move on to troubleshooting specific trust services criteria. Maria and I have been working closely with our clients to help them implement these new trust services criteria, and there's definitely some of them that have been more cumbersome than others to implement, or ones that we've just gotten a lot of questions on. So we wanted to spend some time talking about some specific ones. The first one relates to the board of directors demonstrating independence for management and exercises oversight of the development and performance of internal controls. Couple things here. There's usually about 2 good standard controls that will help meet this criteria. One of them is first having a control that establishes that you have an independent board of directors, and sometimes even going a bit further, talking about maybe some subcommittees you have that really are charged with overseeing internal controls, such as an audit committee or a cybersecurity committee. So that's a good one there, is just establishing that you do have independent oversight. And then establishing that there is meetings with the board that discusses internal control and oversight of management. And one of the things that we do get here a lot is, well, what do we do if we don't have a board of directors? We have clients of all sizes, and we do have some that don't have board of directors. So definitely reach out to your service auditor or us if you're coming across that, and we can talk about how we can include some controls that still help meet this criteria. Next is the entity obtains or generates and uses relevant quality information to support the functioning of internal control. I have to say, this is probably my favorite one of trying to figure out some good controls to include here. I think the hard part is, for a lot of my clients, is figuring out what do they mean by relevant quality information. I've listed the points of focus, but where we've went on a lot of clients of figuring out controls here is figuring out, is there something in the risk assessment that could be built into the risk assessment controls to help meet this criteria? Another area to look at is whether there's some system integrity and processing checks. Those have been the most common, but definitely don't feel alone if you're struggling with this one. Come reach out and we can talk through what would work here for having good controls in place. Next is Coso Principle 8, which talks about the entity considers the potential for fraud in assessing risk to the achievement of objectives. In the new criteria, obviously they're specifically calling out fraud where that's not something that's been explicitly called out before. I'm sure entities think about fraud all the time, so it's figuring out how do we build this in to our SOC 2. And also I think where my clients have struggled is, well, what does fraud mean from the SOC 2 perspective and what's in scope? I think it's a little bit easier when you're thinking about fraud of thinking about how it could affect the financial statements or how cash could be stolen, but narrowing it down to really the scope of the SOC 2 is a little bit more difficult. So what I've been counseling people to do is build this into your risk assessment process. Think about, is there ways fraud could be committed with the system? And document that in the risk assessment and document how you address that. And you know, sometimes there's things that you accept because it's not that big of a risk, but there could be things that you come across that really are a fraud risk and you should have a mitigation plan in place. And then with fraud, one of the key things is really thinking about the fraud triangle. In order to commit fraud, there needs to be incentives and pressures, opportunities and attitudes and realizations. So that also kind of helps thinking through fraud and assessing how it could affect the scope of your SOC 2. The next one is Coso Principle 9, which says the entity identifies and assesses changes that could significantly impact the system of internal control. This is another great one where you probably have to expand controls from what you had before, but you can build them into controls you already had in place. So you probably had a risk assessment control, and just making that more explicit that during the risk assessment you're thinking through changes during the year or upcoming changes that could impact your system of internal control. Things like the external environment, your business model, changes in leadership and management. Has there been a lot of turnover or is there expected changes in management? How are systems and technology changing? Do you have new critical vendors? These are different things that if you integrate it into your risk assessment, it's an easy way to make sure you get coverage of this for your SOC 2 report. The next one says the entity evaluates and communicates internal control deficiencies in a timely manner to those parties responsible for taking corrective action, which includes senior management and the board of directors. Couple things here. This is another principle that specifically calls out the board of directors. So going back to the first slide in this section where we talked about meetings with the board of directors being a good control, making it clear in that control that you're also going to make sure you're communicating to management and the board of directors specifically any internal control deficiencies. That helps meet this control. A key here is, well, what is an internal control deficiency? So thinking through what that means in the scope of your SOC 2, and also realizing this is not just internal control deficiencies that maybe we find during the SOC 2 audit, like maybe there's a couple exceptions for controls that would meet this requirement, but also internally if you found any deficiencies, making sure that those are communicated up. And it doesn't mean that every deficiency needs to be communicated. It's figuring out what is a big enough deal that needs to be, first communicated to management and then on to the board of directors. Coso Principle 11 talks about selecting and developing general control activities over technology to support the achievement of objectives. I think what people struggle with here is it's just very broad. Sometimes it seems like, well, any of my SOC 2 controls could fit this, or especially some of the more technical controls. So this is really focusing on some of the points of focus are around technology infrastructure controls, security management controls, and system development controls. And I wouldn't go to the extent that you feel like you need to list like 10 controls to meet each of those bullet points. Think about what really gets at the heart of this. Some of the things we've seen is some risk assessment controls, vendor management controls, maybe penetration or vulnerability testing, or controls that really focus on the policies and procedures you have in place that guide your controls and processes. So that would be a way to narrow it to maybe like 5 or 6 key things versus feeling like I have 20 or 30 controls that could fit here. So those are the ones we wanted to draw attention to. They're all worth talking through because they're just a little bit different than what you've seen in the past. But I think what you'll find with the new trust services criteria is that really 90% of your controls or more will have a new home with the new criteria, and that there's a few areas where you'll need to add some brand new controls or expand controls to meet the new criteria. And that's probably not a huge number of controls. So it can seem overwhelming when you start this process, but at the end of the day, I think you'll find that the controls you have in place are a good set for just finding where they'll fit with the new criteria. So key takeaways, we talked about making sure you understand the new criteria, as I mentioned, identifying where to add or expand control. I hope you learned some best practices for vendor management and risk assessment, and then that diving into some of these specific criteria helped you understand what some of these ones are meaning when they seem a little bit more vague or broad.
So let's do this. I have one question I'd like to cover, Kim, as we wrap up, and let's go up here too. And thank you so much, everyone, for all your great questions. And we just don't have time to answer all of them inside the scope of this call today. But regarding continued monitoring, are there specific controls outlined similar to the continuous monitoring added to PCI DSS? And Maria, maybe you can cover that for us.
Yes, I would love to. So SOC is not as prescriptive, excuse me, as PCI DSS. So as such, AACPA does not really have specific requirements of how to satisfy your monitoring. It's always a good rule of thumb to either have or use a more prescriptive framework to base your controls off of, such as PCI DSS or FedRAMP, or to work with your auditor and make sure that the monitoring controls that you have in place are indeed satisfactory to your organization.
Great, great. And with that, we want to thank you, Kim and Maria, so much for your time today. We had, everyone had a lot of great questions, but you took the time and your willingness to share your experience and your insight. It's invaluable. We know that change is good, and the trust services criteria are no exception. If you find you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either of our presenters. This session was recorded and will be available shortly in an on-demand format for you to review or share with others. We want to thank you for joining us and ask you to take just a few minutes and tell us how we did and how we can improve and what you'd like to see us deliver in the future. Lastly, if you viewed this session live and met the criteria to qualify for continuing professional education, you can download your certificate by logging into the on-demand version of the webcast and downloading it from the certification widget. Thank you all for joining us.